They say a man's home is his castle, his comfort, his reward. And for a long time, we believe it. We build walls around our routines, pave paths with predictability, thinking we're building safety. But sometimes what feels like safety, what feels like peace, is just a slower kind of rust, eating away at what you could have been. There was a man who knew this rust, though he didn't call it that. Not then. His name was Floyd, and he was 48 years old, a number that seemed to settle heavier on his shoulders with each passing year. He worked the night shift at the old Millerton Metals plant, the kind of place where the air always smelled faintly of oil and hot steel, and the fluorescent lights hummed a never-ending lullaby. Floyd's face was a map of quiet endurance, lines etched around eyes that had seen more than their fair share of sunrises from the factory floor. His hands, though, they told the truest tale, knuckles thick and scarred, palms ingrained with the ghost of a wrench or a raw metal edge. They were the hands of a man who'd earned his living with honest labor, day in and day out. But beneath that steady, reliable exterior, a quiet weariness clung to him, like the fine dust that settled on everything in the plant. He looked like a man who'd seen a lot of hard days, but still carried a quiet resilience, an unspent strength just waiting for something to spark it. Every morning, as the first pale light bled into the gray of the sky, Floyd would be clocking out, the metallic clang of the time card machine a final, stark period to another 8 hours. The drive home was short, a familiar blur of darkened houses and empty streets, his old sedan rattling its complaint against the cold asphalt. He'd pull into the driveway of his parents' old house, a modest 2-story place with peeling paint on the window sills and a sag in the porch that he always meant to fix. Always meant to? Inside, the silence was thick, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. He'd kick off his steel-toed boots by the door, the laces undone, and walk straight to the kitchen. A glass of water, maybe a leftover sandwich from yesterday, then straight to the bedroom. The curtains were always drawn tight, blocking out the sun he was about to miss. He'd strip down, the smell of grease and sweat clinging to his clothes, and fall onto the bed, the familiar dip in the mattress cradling him like an old friend. Sleep came easy, a heavy, dreamless escape, until the insistent chirp of his alarm dragged him back to consciousness around 2 p.m. Afternoons were a slow, quiet drift. He'd usually find himself on the worn armchair in the living room, the flickering blue light of the television filling the empty space. Sometimes he'd flip through the channels, sometimes he'd just stare at a static scene, the voices on the screen a low drone. Dinner was usually something simple, a frozen meal, a can of soup, or if he felt ambitious, scrambled eggs. His plate sat heavy on his lap, the silence of the room punctuated only by the clink of his fork. He had no one to share it with, just the echoes of conversations from years gone by. His job at Millerton Metals wasn't complex. For 25 years, he'd operated the same press, shaping raw steel into components for various machines. Push the button, watch the die descend, pull the lever, repeat. The rhythm of it was burned into his bones, a monotonous ballet of man and machine, whump clang hiss, over and over. He could do it in his sleep, and sometimes he felt like he was. It paid the bills just barely. The house was inherited, so no mortgage, but property taxes, utilities, insurance, the aging car's endless demands, they added up. Every month he played a quiet game of Tetris with his bank account, trying to make the last few dollars stretch until the next payday. There was no real cushion, no grand plans, just enough. Enough to keep the lights on, enough to keep the old sedan running, enough to buy the same groceries, enough to keep the humdrum going. This existence, this predictable, unchanging loop, was Floyd's carefully constructed world. It wasn't exciting, wasn't fulfilling in any grand sense, but it was safe. Safe from surprises, safe from challenges, safe from the unknown. He had honed his ability to avoid anything that might disrupt the gentle current of his life. Learning something new, too much effort, taking on extra responsibility, too much risk. He'd seen guys push for promotions, seen them get stressed out, seen them fail. Better to stay in his lane, he figured. Better to know your place, keep your head down, and just get by. That's what he told himself anyway. But deep down, beneath the quiet contentment he projected, there was a gnawing understanding. This safe path, this path of least resistance, had slowly, almost imperceptibly, started to make him soft. Not just physically, though the factory floor kept him moving, but mentally. His muscles of ambition had atrophied, his curiosity had withered. He wasn't just avoiding challenges. He was avoiding life itself, choosing the quiet, dusty corner when the whole wide world was out there, roaring. The roar of the world felt distant, a sound from another planet, barely reaching the quiet, dusty corner Floyd had chosen for himself. His own world, by contrast, was a steady, predictable hum. The clang of the factory whistle signaling the end of his shift was his cue, a familiar release. He'd punch out, the clock spitting out his card with a mechanical shrug, and walk past the younger guys laughing, planning their evenings, their lives stretching out before them like an open road. Floyd just offered a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his head, a ghost of a nod, and made his way to his rust-flecked sedan in the employee lot. The drive home was always the same, a hypnotic repetition of the familiar. The same cracks in the pavement, the same faded billboards, the same diner marquee with its perpetually burnt out. E and T. His house, a two-story box on Elm Street, sat nestled amongst others just like it, a silent testament to an era when solid factory jobs had built this town. Inside, the air hung with the faint, lingering scent of old coffee and dust, a scent that had been there since his parents passed, a comfort that had long since turned into a shroud. His life was a well-worn groove, deep and familiar, but shallow too. Every evening, the same ritual. Dinner, usually something quick and reheated, eaten in front of the flickering blue light of the television. The news, then a rerun of a classic sitcom, then maybe a documentary he'd half-watch before drifting off in his recliner, only to rouse himself for bed. Weekends were a slightly longer version of the same, perhaps a trip to the hardware store for a repair he'd put off for months, or a phone call with his sister that invariably ended with her gentle urging to, "Get out more, Floyd." He'd promise he would, knowing full well he would. The easy path, remember. It had become his only path. Then came the rumble, not a tremor in the earth, but a tremor in the very foundations of his comfort. It started as whispers on the factory floor, hushed conversations near the time clock, then official memos taped to bulletin boards that Floyd, in his quiet way, tried to ignore. The company was investing, they said, modernizing, automation. New machinery was coming, state-of-the-art robots that would handle the bulk of the heavy lifting, the repetitive tasks. And with them, new roles. Higher-skilled roles. Every single one of them, from the oldest hands to the freshest hires, would be required to undergo a comprehensive training program. Learn the new systems, learn to operate the sophisticated controls, or, well, the unspoken alternative hung in the air like exhaust fumes. Redundancy. Floyd felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Learn? He hadn't truly learned anything new since he figured out how to program a VCR back in the 90s. His job for decades had been a masterclass in repetition, in the steady, rhythmic movement of his hands, in the familiar whine of the old presses. His mind, he'd secretly suspected, had gotten as comfortable as his body in the recliner. He procrastinated. He hoped it would blow over, or that he'd be deemed essential enough to simply supervise, to oversee the new machines without actually having to interact with them. He signed up for the training sessions with a reluctant hand, then found excuses to miss the first few. A headache, car trouble. "I'll catch the next one, boss." His supervisor, a stern but generally fair man named Miller, just gave him a look, a knowing tilt of the head that said, "Floyd, you're playing with fire." When he finally couldn't avoid it any longer, he sat in the cold, fluorescent-lit classroom, a knot of dread in his gut. The instructor, a bright-eyed kid barely out of college, spoke a language Floyd barely understood. Algorithms, PLCs, integrated diagnostics. The screen showed complex schematics, wiring diagrams that looked like tangled spaghetti, and sequences of code that might as well have been hieroglyphics. He tried. He really did. But his mind, so accustomed to the simple, tangible mechanics of his old world, simply couldn't grasp the abstract, digital logic of this new one. Hands, so adept at the heavy machinery, felt clumsy and slow on the sensitive touchscreen controls. He failed the first assessment, then the second. The third time, Miller called him into his office. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and impending doom. Miller sat behind a cluttered desk, his usually gruff face softened by a visible weariness. "Floyd," he began, his voice low, "I've known you since you were a young man, good worker, never late, never complained. But this isn't going to work." He pushed a printed report across the desk. 3 failing grades circled in red. "We need people who can run these new systems, Floyd. We're giving you one more chance, one last training module. If you can't pass this one, I don't know what to tell you." The words hit Floyd like a punch to the gut. Redundancy. It wasn't just a threat anymore. It was a looming reality, a dark shadow stretching over his steady, predictable hum. He walked out of Miller's office, past the younger men who now looked at him with a mixture of pity and concern, the factory noise a deafening roar in his ears. His world, his safe, small, comfortable world, was crumbling. The easy path had led him straight to a cliff edge, and he was staring down into the abyss. That night's sleep was a cruel joke. He lay in his bed, the quiet of the house amplified, each creak of the old wood, each distant car, a stark punctuation mark in the silence of his thoughts. The digital clock on his nightstand glowed an unforgiving 3:17 a.m. He stared at the ceiling, seeing not plaster but the schematic diagrams from the training, a confusing maze of lines and symbols that mocked his failure. His mind replayed Miller's words, the pity in his eyes. He replayed the condescending patience of the young instructor, the subtle nudges and whispers from his younger colleagues trying to help him find the right button. He'd been the old dog who couldn't learn new tricks, and the shame burned hotter than any fever. What had his life become? He wasn't just facing losing his job, he was facing losing his entire identity. Floyd, the steady factory man. The man who always knew his place, who always took the path of least resistance. He built a fortress of comfort around himself, brick by brick, avoiding anything that might stretch him, challenge him, or, God forbid, make him feel truly alive. And now that fortress was collapsing inward, threatening to crush him under its debris. A profound, sickening wave of self-pity washed over him. He was 48 years old, no wife, no kids, just a quiet house full of memories and a job that was about to disappear. What was he going to do? Where would he go? The thought of starting over, of applying for new jobs, of learning something entirely new, filled him with a terror so cold it made his teeth chatter. He'd never truly pushed himself, never truly risked anything, always choosing the soft landing. And now there was no soft landing, just a hard, unforgiving ground rushing up to meet him. He was a coward. The word, unspoken, echoed in the silent room. He'd chosen comfort, and comfort had made him weak, soft, utterly unprepared for the inevitable storms of life. He'd let opportunities slip by, dismissed dreams as unrealistic, all to maintain this fragile peace. And for what? So he could end up here at 3 a.m., alone in the dark, utterly terrified and completely adrift. The comfortable prison he'd built for himself had finally locked him in, and the key was nowhere to be found. A single tear tracked a path through the faint stubble on his cheek. It tasted like bitter regret. The taste lingered, a cold, metallic tang on his tongue, mirroring the leaden weight in his gut. This wasn't just a bad night. This was the culmination of months, years even, of carefully constructed avoidance crumbling down around him. He squeezed his eyes shut, as if he could unsee the moment that had started it all, the moment the comfortable floor of his life had begun to crack. It had started subtly enough, just another email from Human Resources in late November. Usually, those were about holiday schedules or benefit plan updates, easily skimmed and forgotten. But this one had a different tone, a grim formality that pricked at something Floyd had long buried. Mandatory all-staff meeting, plant automation initiative, the subject line read. He remembered shrugging it off that morning, figuring it was just more corporate bluster, another efficiency drive that would blow over. He'd seen them come and go. But this one didn't blow over. It came down like a hammer. The break room, usually a haven of stale coffee and sports talk, had a different hum that day. Tense, Mr. Henderson, the plant manager, stood stiffly beside a projected slideshow. His voice, usually booming, was tight, careful. He spoke of efficiency gains and market competitiveness, but the words that echoed in the quietest corners of the room were job reallocation and upskilling requirements. On the screen flashed sleek, robotic arms, complex dashboards, and flow charts that looked like alien languages. Floyd felt a cold dread settle deep in his bones. This wasn't just an efficiency drive. This was a complete overhaul, and it was aimed squarely at men like him, men who had mastered the old ways, the reliable, muscle memory ways. His first reaction was denial, a well-worn shield he'd polished over decades. "They can't replace us," he'd muttered to Jimmy, who just stared blankly at the screen. "I've been here 30 years. I know this plant inside and out." He'd convinced himself it was just a scare tactic, that he was too valuable, too ingrained in the very fabric of the factory floor. He'd seen managers come and go, initiatives rise and fall. He'd simply outlast them, comfortable in his routine, a silent, steady fixture. But this time, the initiative didn't waver. Training schedules were posted. Mandatory. Floyd signed up for the latest possible slots, procrastinating as long as he could. When he finally showed up, the classroom felt alien. Young guys, fresh out of technical school, zipped through modules on touchscreens. Floyd, his fingers gnarled from years of gripping wrenches, fumbled with the mouse, his eyes glazing over the circuit diagrams and code snippets. The words blurred. His mind, accustomed to the predictable rhythm of gears and levers, rebelled against the abstract logic of programming. He felt a dull panic tighten his chest. He tried to learn, or at least he told himself he did. He'd sit in front of the practice console, stare at the blinking lights, and feel his mind drift to what was on TV that night. He'd nod along when the instructor spoke, scribble a few meaningless notes, and then slip out as soon as possible, relieved to be back in the familiar grind of his shift, pretending the future wasn't looming. He'd rationalize. Too old for this newfangled stuff. My brain just ain't wired for it anymore. It was a comforting lie, a soft blanket over the chilling truth of his fear. Then came the tests, the practical assessments on the new assembly line. His turn, the supervisor, a patient but tired-looking woman named Brenda, stood nearby. Floyd's hands trembled. He couldn't remember the sequence, couldn't locate the right menu on the screen. The machine flashed an error code. He tried again, another error. Brenda's lips pressed into a thin line. "Floyd," she'd said, her voice gentle but firm, "you're falling behind. You really need to put more effort into this." Humiliation burned through him, a searing flush that had nothing to do with the factory heat. He failed the first test, then the second. By the third, a final warning was issued. He was told, plainly, that if he didn't pass the next one, his position would be redundant. His world, the one he'd so carefully kept small and predictable, was about to shatter. That was the bitter regret that lingered from the 3 a.m. tier. The cold, metallic taste in his mouth wasn't just of fear, but of the knowledge that he had done this to himself. His stubborn loyalty to comfort, his avoidance of anything new, had led him to this precipice. He had let himself become weak, not from hard work, but from the deliberate choice of ease. The comfortable prison he'd built had finally locked him in, and the key to learning, to adapting, to growth, had been right there. He just refused to pick it up. He was a man about to lose his job, his home, his entire predictable existence because he was too afraid to be uncomfortable. The thought was a raw, visceral punch to the gut. He didn't sleep again that night. He lay there, rigid, listening to the house creak, watching the shadows slowly morph into the gray light of dawn. The weight in his gut didn't lift. It settled, heavy and solid, into a new, quiet resolve. There was no grand epiphany, no sudden surge of motivation that turned him into a new man overnight. It was simply enough. Enough of the fear, enough of the excuses, enough of shrinking from life. He still didn't know how he was going to fix it, how he was going to climb out of this hole he'd dug. But he knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and strangely liberating that he couldn't stay in it. He wouldn't. This wasn't him. Not anymore. When his alarm clock, a trusty old relic with a tinny bell, finally blared at 5 a.m., Floyd didn't hit the snooze button. Not this time. He didn't even hesitate. His muscles were stiff, his mind still foggy with exhaustion, but there was a flicker, a stubborn spark that hadn't been there before. He got out of bed, the floorboards groaning in protest. He went through the motions of his morning routine, the same weak coffee, the same worn clothes, but with a new awareness. Today, he wasn't going to the factory to pretend. He was going to work, yes, but he was also going to start learning. His first step was clumsy, almost pathetic. Instead of heading straight to his truck after breakfast, he walked over to the stack of training manuals he'd ignored for months, gathering dust on a shelf in the corner of his living room. His hand hovered over the top one. Introduction to Automated Systems, Module 1. He felt the familiar resistance, the urge to just leave it, to pretend it wasn't there. His mind whispered, "What's the point, Floyd? You tried. You failed. You're too old." The comfort of giving up, of retreating, was a siren song. But then he remembered the fear of the previous night, the taste of bitter regret. He swallowed hard. His fingers closed around the spine of the book, pulling it free. It felt heavier than it looked, solid, substantial. He carried it to his kitchen table, usually reserved for solo meals and bills. He sat down, the chair scraping loudly against the linoleum. He didn't open it immediately. He just stared at the cover, his name, Floyd, a faint echo in his mind, then he flipped the page. The first diagram, dense with arrows and unfamiliar symbols, swam before his tired eyes. He didn't understand a damn thing, but he didn't close it. He just kept looking. And for the first time in a long time, that quiet resistance, that persistent fear of disruption didn't win. He was here. He was trying. It was a start. A hard, uncomfortable, utterly necessary start. The first night, Floyd barely made it through a single page. Not because he was slow, but because every line felt like a foreign language, every diagram a cruel joke. He reread sentences, his brow furrowed, the words blurring into an incomprehensible mess. His old habit, the one that said, "This is too hard," closed the book, turned on the TV, screamed in his ear. He felt the familiar weight of defeat settling in, the comfort of knowing he could just stop. He could just accept his fate. But the memory of the cold dread, the image of that severance package, held him captive in the chair. He pushed through, forcing his eyes to stay on the page even if his mind wasn't grasping it. It was a purely physical act of defiance against his own nature. The next morning, back on the factory floor, the machines seemed even more alien. Younger guys, fresh out of technical college, zipped around, tapping screens, making adjustments with casual confidence. Floyd felt like a ghost, an artifact from a bygone era. He watched them, trying to connect the abstract symbols from the manual to the physical gears and circuits. It was like trying to learn a language by reading a dictionary without ever hearing it spoken. He fumbled with the old panel, doing his regular job, but his eyes kept drifting to the shimmering new interfaces, his stomach clenching. During his lunch break, instead of his usual newspaper, he pulled out the manual. He tried to decipher a wiring diagram while gnawing on a stale sandwich, the grease on his fingers smudging the glossy pages. A few of the younger guys glanced over, then snickered softly, their whispers carrying just enough for him to catch. Old dog knew tricks. The shame burned hot and familiar, but this time it was mixed with a stubborn spark. Days bled into a week. Every evening the ritual was the same. Dinner, then the kitchen table, the manual splayed open. He'd reread, draw crude sketches in a cheap notebook he bought, trying to visualize the logic. He felt like he was slogging through mud. There were moments, stretches of 20 minutes, an hour even, where not a single new concept would penetrate. His brain felt like a concrete wall. The urge to quit was a constant hum, a dull ache behind his eyes. He'd stare at the TV in the living room, dark and silent, imagining the mindless comfort of a crime drama, a sports game. That was his old life, easy, predictable, safe. This new life, with its constant mental grind, felt like a punishment. Then came the new training session, the third one he'd attended. The instructor, a clean-cut guy half Floyd's age, walked through the setup sequence for a new robotic arm. Floyd tried to follow, but his mind kept jumping back to the incomprehensible diagrams, the jumble of terms. When it came time for the practical exercise, his hands trembled. He pressed the wrong button not once, but twice, sending the arm into an emergency stop, a shrill alarm piercing the air. The instructor sighed, a long, weary sound that echoed the very judgment Floyd already had for himself. "Floyd, we've gone over this," he said, his voice laced with an exasperated patience that felt worse than anger. "You need to pay attention." The familiar taste of failure, bitter and metallic, filled his mouth. He mumbled an apology, his face hot, and stepped aside, letting a younger man complete the task flawlessly. That night, he nearly left the manual untouched. He actually walked over to the TV remote, his hand reaching for it, his body aching for the sweet release of oblivion. This is it, he thought. I just can't do it. But then the quiet dread returned, stronger, sharper this time. He saw himself walking out of the factory gates for the last time, saw the empty days stretching ahead, felt the cold weight of irreversible regret. The comfort he craved, the comfort of giving up, suddenly looked like a cage. He pictured the scorn in the instructor's eyes, the knowing glances of his coworkers. He was already drowning. What was the point of making it easier to sink? With a guttural sound, a half-snort, half-groan of pure frustration and resolve, he turned away from the remote. He sat back at the kitchen table, slammed the manual open to the offending wiring diagram, and stared at it, not with hope, but with pure, unadulterated anger. He wouldn't understand it, maybe. But he wouldn't stop looking at it. He pushed through the diagram again, tracing the lines with a pencil, drawing and redrawing the circuit. It was slow, agonizing work. He missed something, a small detail, a tiny arrow indicating current flow. He went back to the first module, then the second, cross-referencing, his mind a throbbing mess of circuits and logic gates. He barely slept, fueled by instant coffee and a growing desperation. Around day 14, almost 2 weeks after his start, something shifted, a tiny flicker. He was looking at a specific sequence, a series of relays that controlled the robot's grip strength. He'd seen it 100 times. This time, as he traced the path from the sensor to the actuator, a connection formed, a click. Not a loud one, not a revelation, but a small, almost imperceptible click in his understanding. He saw how the signal flowed, how one part directly influenced the next. It wasn't just lines on a page anymore. It was a story, a simple, mechanical story. He stared, then felt a faint, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. It was a tiny crack in the concrete wall of his mind, but it was there, and through that crack a sliver of light. He knew he still had miles to go, mountains to climb, but for the first time he didn't feel like he was just sinking. He felt like he was finally, painfully learning to tread water, and he didn't stop. He pushed that pencil harder, leaned closer to the page, chasing that flicker, desperate to keep the light alive. He understood one thing, just one tiny thing, but it was enough. It was enough to keep him from reaching for that remote control, for another night. That tiny click, that single thread of understanding, it was like a seed buried in dry earth finally finding a drop of water. It didn't sprout into a mighty oak overnight, no, not Floyd, but it kept him digging. The next day, he wasn't just staring at the diagrams, he was tracing them with a purpose. He started asking the trainer, Mr. Henderson, small, specific questions. Not, how do I do this? But why does this happen when this condition is met? Henderson, a man who usually looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, blinked at him. He'd seen Floyd's blank stare, his slumped shoulders. Now there was a flicker in the older man's eyes, a hint of something resembling genuine curiosity. Floyd started staying an extra hour, then two after the regular training session was over, hunched over the terminal, the glow of the screen reflecting in his tired but now intensely focused eyes. He wasn't trying to finish, he was trying to understand. He'd draw the circuits freehand in his notebook, over and over, until the lines felt etched into his own brain, not just the paper. He started connecting the abstract symbols to the clanking, whirring reality of the machines on the factory floor, visualizing the current, the hydraulic fluid, the robotic arm's precise movements. A few days later, maybe around day 20 since his forced reckoning, Henderson walked by and saw Floyd explaining a particularly finicky sensor calibration to another younger guy, Dave, who was also struggling. Floyd wasn't preaching. He was just patiently walking Dave through the logical sequence, pointing to the screen, his finger following the flow, his voice low and steady. Henderson just kept walking, a faint, almost imperceptible nod of his head. He didn't say anything, but the next morning he left a small, laminated troubleshooting guide on Floyd's workstation. No fanfare, no words, just the guide. It was a silent acknowledgement, a tiny gesture that spoke volumes. Floyd still felt the drag of old habits, the pull of the couch, the comfort of the television's numb embrace. But now, when he felt it, he also felt a competing pull, a low thrum of challenge, a whisper of potential. He was still tired, always tired, but it was a different kind of fatigue, a productive, earned exhaustion that came from using his brain in ways he hadn't in decades. He wasn't avoiding sleep anymore, he was earning it. He'd walk home through the quiet streets, the streetlights casting long shadows, and instead of dread, he'd feel a faint hum of satisfaction, a small triumph from having wrestled with a complex problem, and even if he didn't solve it completely, having gained a deeper insight into its tangled guts. Hope wasn't a sunrise yet, but it was definitely the faintest pre-dawn light, promising a new day. Weeks rolled into a month, then two. The automation went live. The factory floor, once a familiar symphony of old machines, was now a ballet of precise, controlled chaos. The new robotic arms swung and swiveled with unnerving speed, and the consoles blinked with endless data. Many of the old guard, the ones who scoffed at the training, found themselves reassigned to less skilled, often lower-paying positions, or worse, out the door entirely. But Floyd, he was there, not just keeping pace, but excelling. He was one of the few who could quickly diagnose a glitch in the new optical sorting system, tracing the error code back to a faulty proximity sensor with a quiet efficiency that surprised even himself. His hands, still calloused from years of manual labor, now moved with a new dexterity, tapping commands on the touchscreen, recalibrating a laser array with a precision that belied his former reluctance. His shoulders were still broad, his face still bore the lines of hard living, but his eyes were different. They weren't just observant, they were discerning, alive with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. He walked with a different gait, a slight spring in his step, not the defeated shuffle of the man who merely endured. One afternoon, he found himself explaining a complex programming shortcut to the new shift supervisor, a sharp young woman fresh out of engineering school. She listened intently, took notes, and then looking at him with genuine respect said, "Floyd, you really understand these machines, don't you?" He just nodded, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. It wasn't about the promotion, the raise, or even the recognition. It was about proving to himself that he wasn't just old dog, but a dog that could learn a whole new set of tricks. He wasn't the creature of habit anymore, stuck in the mud. He was still Floyd, still preferred a quiet evening, but the world didn't scare him as much. He knew he could adapt. He knew he could learn. And the comfort he now found wasn't in the absence of challenge, but in the strength he'd forged by facing it head-on. The factory, once a cage, was now a proving ground. and he was standing firm. Floyd's quiet resilience now radiated a subtle confidence that went beyond the factory gates. That leaky faucet in the kitchen, ignored for years, finally got fixed. The worn-out screen door, rattling loose in its frame, was resecured. He started taking the longer route to the grocery store just to feel the satisfying ache in his legs. His evenings, once an escape into television's soft glow, became moments of quiet reflection, a peace hard-earned and deeply felt. He still liked his routine, still preferred the familiar, but it was different now. The familiar was a choice, not a cage. Sometimes, in those moments, a wry smile would touch his lips. He'd think about how close he came to losing it all, about the man he used to be. Funny, he'd muse to himself, the words barely a whisper. I used to think easy was good. Turns out, easy just makes you weak. When I finally hit rock bottom, I figured getting back up isn't about avoiding the fall. It's about learning how to land and push off stronger. Comfort ain't your friend, it's just a comfy prison. He wasn't mad at his past self, just understanding. Like looking at an old photo and realizing how much you've grown. And so, the man who once let predictable comfort build his cage found his truest freedom on the other side of struggle. He learned true security isn't found in what you avoid, but in what you're brave enough to face. He walked a little straighter, looked folks in the eye a little longer. He was still Floyd, still a factory man, but he was standing firm on ground he'd built himself, brick by hard-won brick. The greatest prison we build is made of comfort, and the key to escape is forged in the fires of failure. The rhythmic hum of the upgraded machinery had become Floyd's new lullaby, a sound he found profoundly satisfying. He moved with an easy competence between control panels and production lines. His fingers, once clumsy and hesitant on the new interfaces, now danced across touchscreens with practiced precision. He wasn't just operating the machines. He understood them, or at least, he understood his part in their intricate dance. He often caught himself tracing a pipeline with his gaze, or listening intently to a strange thrumming, wondering about its source, a curiosity he would have squashed years ago as not his problem. Then came the morning the hum stopped. Not entirely, but a vital section of the main assembly line went silent, spitting out half-formed parts onto a conveyor belt before grinding to a halt. A ripple of frustration, quickly morphing into panic, spread through the floor. The foreman, a perpetually stressed man named Gary, was already yelling into his two-way radio, his face flushed. Maintenance! Get down here now. Line 2 is down. Floyd watched from a few yards away, his initial instinct to retreat to a less affected section of the factory. The old Floyd would have found a quiet corner, hoping the problem resolved itself, grateful it wasn't his fault. But the new Floyd felt a different kind of pull. It wasn't responsibility exactly, not yet, but a quiet, almost academic interest. He walked closer, observing the stalled machinery, the glow of its diagnostic panel blinking an angry red. The digital display flashed. Error 73, primary feed mechanism jam. He saw 2 maintenance technicians, young men barely out of trade school, already clambering over the steel frame, their tools clanking. They looked overwhelmed. Can't see anything, Dave. One shouted, wiping grease from his brow. Looks clear. The other, Dave, sighed, pulling out a thick manual. Gary paced impatiently, his eyes darting to the overhead clock. Every minute lost was money out of their pocket and potentially hours of overtime for a stressed-out crew. Floyd hovered, a silent observer. He remembered the old feeder mechanism, the clunky hydraulics, the way the parts used to get stuck if the angle was off by even a fraction of an inch. He'd seen it hundreds of times. This new one was sleeker, supposedly jam-proof. But technology, he'd learned, wasn't foolproof, just a different kind of tool. He watched the technicians poke and prod, trying to follow the manual's flowcharts. They were looking at the system, the code, the schematics. Floyd, however, was looking at the parts. His gaze fell on a small pile of misaligned components near the intake chute, the very ones the machine had rejected before shutting down. He remembered a subtle alteration they'd made to the feeder plate calibration during the upgrade, a small adjustment he himself had suggested during his reluctant training, a tiny detail the trainers had almost dismissed but ultimately implemented. It had improved efficiency, they said. But now, seeing the jammed mechanism, a thought sparked. He took a hesitant step closer. Gary, overhearing another fruitless exchange between the technicians, looked up, annoyance etched on his face. Something wrong, Floyd? You got a problem with line 1? He barked, assuming Floyd was complaining. Floyd swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. Speaking up, offering an unsolicited opinion, especially to Gary, was exactly the kind of disruption his old self would have avoided at all costs. His heart gave a familiar flutter of anxiety. Just walk away, Floyd. Let them handle it. But then the words from his own mantra echoed in his mind. Comfort ain't your friend, it's just a comfy prison. And growth lay on the other side of struggle. This wasn't a struggle of brute force or complex equations, but of stepping forward, of using his observation, of taking a risk. No, Gary, Floyd said, his voice surprisingly steady, though a little softer than he intended. He gestured towards the feeder mechanism. Mind if I take a look? Gary squinted at him, surprised. Floyd wasn't the type to offer help, let alone on something as critical as a line stoppage. What do you know about this new tech, Floyd? Thought you were barely getting the hang of it last month. There was a hint of the old disdain in Gary's tone, the echo of Floyd's initial struggles. I've been working on it, Floyd replied simply, his gaze firm. He wasn't defensive, just stating a fact. I think I might have an idea about the feeder. Dave, the lead technician, scoffed from inside the machine. Unless you're a software engineer, pal, I don't think you're going to fix error 73. This is deep-level stuff. Floyd didn't respond to Dave. He kept his eyes on Gary, a quiet intensity in them that Gary hadn't seen before. Gary hesitated, then sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. All right, Floyd, 5 minutes, but don't mess anything up. Floyd nodded. He picked up one of the malformed parts, turning it over in his calloused hand. He moved deliberately, not rushing, avoiding the technicians who were still consulting their screens. He reached into the feeder's intake, feeling along the metal plates. His fingers brushed against something. He leaned in, peering into the narrow gap where the parts entered the main assembly. See that plate there? He asked, pointing with a long, steady finger to a spot Dave hadn't even looked at. The secondary guide plate? Dave craned his neck, looking where Floyd indicated. Yeah, what about it? It's set too shallow, Floyd said, his voice gaining confidence as his observations clicked into place. When we adjusted the primary feeder's angle for efficiency, it subtly changed how the parts hit this secondary guide. For most parts, it's fine, but some, the slightly imperfect ones, they're catching. They're not jamming the main mechanism, not directly. They're just bouncing off this plate at a bad angle and getting stuck before they even enter the mechanism properly. The sensor's picking up the backlog, not a direct jam. Dave and his colleague exchanged a glance. It sounded plausible, and it was certainly a perspective they hadn't considered, focused as they were on the machine's internal diagnostics. The old feeder had its quirks, and Floyd knew them intimately. Now he was applying that same detailed, practical knowledge to the new system, seeing the interaction of physical parts beyond the digital error codes. So what, you want to adjust the angle on that guide plate? Dave asked, skepticism still coloring his voice. That'll need recalibration of the whole intake. Just a fractional degree, Floyd clarified.